Good evening and thanks for joining us. The contents are still secret. The Attorney General is still reviewing, and the demands to see Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report on the almost 2-year investigation into President Trump and Russian election interference are growing. Photographers tracked the movements of Attorney General William Barr as he left home this morning. Yesterday, in a letter to congressional leaders, Barr said he anticipated he might be, quote, in a position to advise you of the special counsel's principal conclusions as soon as this weekend. President Trump remained at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, where he played golf. Democrats and Republicans held conference calls to consider strategies. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi issued a statement to her Democratic colleagues in advance of their call, asking that any briefings about the Mueller report be, quote, unclassified so that members can speak freely about every aspect of the report. For analysis and a look at what may be coming next, we turn to Ryan Goodman, a professor of law at New York University School of Law and co-editor-in-chief of the online forum Just Security. We are kind of in this holding pattern right now, but is there anything that prevents this report and the sort of digested version from being public documents?
There's nothing that prevents it by a matter of law. So this really is the discretion of the Attorney General. There might be some caveats there for classified information, but that's the only kind of real caveat. Otherwise, there's nothing barring him from being able to provide this to Congress and to the public.
Given that there has been public interest, even deemed by a vote from the majority of the House, to say, hey, make this public, right? I mean, is there a strong incentive then for Barr, for his own transparency interests, to make sure that this all looks above board, to try to make more of it as public as possible?
I think so. I think it's an important historical moment when he went up for his nomination. He, in fact, basically committed to the Senate that he would make it as transparent as possible, consistent with the law. And since there's no real legal barrier, I think that's the position that he's in, and there's just kind of overwhelming support, it seems, in the country that the public really wants to know what has happened here and what did Mueller find.
So that central tension between transparency and making sure that people who are not indicted, who are mentioned, who have been investigated, who have not been charged with any crimes, their privacy is protected. Even though for the past couple of years we've also seen several staffers inside the Department of Justice have their kind of private texts and everything else splayed out, even though they haven't been charged with particular crimes.
Right, so that's another concern, and that's a kind of a general concern that might come up in criminal prosecutions. And if somebody's deemed not to be indictable because there's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt that they committed the crime. But this is a different kind of a setting in the sense that Mueller is primarily given the mandate of a counterintelligence investigation to find out if there is derogatory information about people. Were there Americans who helped the Russians interfere in the election? And then it's not really a response to say, yes, but because they didn't commit a crime, we can't know about it. You could easily see that the Justice Department would reach the view that in the public interest, they do need to reveal some of this information so that the public knows what exactly Mueller found. Maybe it's even exonerating. It actually says that there's good information, that people did not really go along with the Russians.
So besides what the Department of Justice or what the special counsel finds today, is there a possibility here that this kicks some of these pieces of information down the road to, say, the Southern District of New York or other jurisdictions that might have interest in this?
I think so. It's so difficult to know what's in that report and what exactly was in Mueller's mind when he decided to wrap up now. But I think a highly plausible explanation of all of this is he completed his counterintelligence mandate, he finished his probe, that was the main objective. And then he reports that to Congress, or he reports that to the Attorney General, and then if there's anything left over in the criminal setting, he hands it off to the Southern District of New York, to the DC office of the Justice Department, as he's done with other parts of this investigation. This would be special because you'd actually be handing off parts that deal with the Russia element of it, so that would be new, and that's why it's still difficult to tell without knowing exactly what's in that report.
Sure. There's the report, and then there's the kind of interpretation of that report and the public perception of that report, and it seems like it's a Rorschach test in America right now. If you're a supporter of the president, the president has called this a witch hunt 180 plus times. He says this is, completely a hoax in the first place. And then there's, of course, Democrats on the other side who've been really putting a lot of political eggs in this basket and saying, let's wait for this report, let's wait for this report, right? So regardless of what is actually published today, tomorrow, this week, people are not that likely to have move their kind of points of view on things.
I think that might be right. It's a sorry state about our political affairs in the sense that we might have very credible information coming from Mueller one way or the other, and the spin is going to happen in one direction or the other, where people already have their preconceived views. in a certain sense, about what happened in 2016 and what they think about this president. So I think it's going to be a really interesting and important moment for the country to see whether or not something like this can actually penetrate and change people's minds.
All right, Ryan Goodman from NYU and the Just Security blog. Thanks so much.
Thank you.